Hey everybody. This is a piece by a person whose name I'm going to guess is pronounced Ljiljana Radonić. It's titled New Antisemitism and the New Media, Leftist Derealization of Islamist, quote, Emancipation. Jean Emery referred to leftist anti-Zionists as bara Antisemiten, and quote, virtuous anti-Semites. While far-right anti-Semitism had been delegitimized after the defeat of the Nazis, and its proponents now communicate in codes directing their resentment, for instance, at the quote, East Coast, leftist anti-Semites present themselves as anti-fascists. This paper presented as part of the quote, Internet and Anti-Semitism, end quote, panel, argues that this distinction also influences the logic of how leftist anti-Semites use the new media. Before I elaborate on this theory-driven hypothesis with regard to Antisemitism 2.0, it must be clarified that leftist anti-Semitism is best understood as one variant of modern anti-Semitism in its post-Holocaust transformation. Footnote, of course, the quote, left is a very unspecific term. Here it applies to a broad spectrum from center-left positions to the lunatic fringe in post-National Socialist Germany and Austria. End footnote. I will then introduce the term, quote, new anti-Semitism to describe a far-reaching ideological convergence of anti-Semitism since 9/11 and the, quote, Second Intifada, across a range of ideologies and milieus that traditionally had precious little in common. At its heart lies a form of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism that unites Islamists with many on the far right and the left. The second empirical part of my contribution analyzes the impact of this new anti-Semitism on discussions in leftist new media. I will focus specifically on the reactions to the Hamas policy paper of 2017, which some erroneously understood as a new Hamas charter. The portrayal of Hamas by parts of the left as the moderate variant of political Islam willing to integrate as an emancipatory movement struggling for political freedom is almost as old as the original Hamas charter. When in 2017 various leftists suddenly acknowledged Hamas's anti-Semitism of the past, they did so only in order to assure us that, with this new policy paper, the Islamist terror organization really had now repudiated the anti-Semitic parts of the 1988 charter. This speaks to a high level of, quote, derealization, and, quote, whitewashing is Hamas's Islamist anti-Semitism in the wake of its ostensible change of heart, which, as I will show, can be witnessed in various new media. Given the anti-Semitism has increased considerably over the last 10 years, not only in the social media, but also in the online comment sections of quality media, in the final part of the essay, I present relevant posts to the discussion forum of the Austrian center-left daily Der Standard, in the wake of the publication of Hamas's policy paper, demonstrating not least that the denial of Islamist anti-Semitism can go hand in hand with the portrayal of Muslims as the new Jews. From modern to new anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is not some marginal phenomenon found only among far-right activists or neo-Nazis should go without saying by now. If one wants to explain its various guises in general, and leftist and, quote, new anti-Semitism in particular, one needs to understand that what anti-Semitism is, and why anti-Semitic explanations play to people's needs. Some authors stress the continuity between religious anti-Judaism before the Spanish Inquisition and Martin Luther's late conviction that Jews cannot become true Christians through baptism on the one hand and modern anti-Semitism on the other. By contrast, I stress both the continuities and the rupture, which went hand in hand with the transformation from pre-modern to modern capitalist society. I will first address the conditions under which modern anti-Semitism developed, surveying how it can be explained in socio-economic and psychological terms. I will then discuss the transformation of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, the emergence of so-called secondary post-Holocaust anti-Semitism, and its expression on the political left. Finally, I will touch on the so-called, quote, new anti-Semitism, the convergence since 9/11 of far-right Muslim and left-wing anti-Semitism on the basis of their shared anti-Zionism. New section, Modern Anti-Semitism. The Frankfurt School in general and Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer in particular did not want to acquire expert knowledge on political extremism, but analyze society as a whole through the prism of the most terrible consequences generated by the principles of its formation. Anti-Semitism takes center stage in the development of this critique because anti-Semitism facilitates the relapse into barbarism and unites all the destructive traits generated by the unfree society. The relapse into barbarism is analyzed as a potentiality of the modern world that culminated in Auschwitz and the other sites of annihilation, yet whose prerequisites persist. The point of departure is the assumption that modern anti-Semitism developed in tandem with bourgeois capitalist society. It followed on from pre-modern forms of anti-Jewish sentiment and took over the object of their hatred. In Europe, the tradition of Christian anti-Judaism was of particular significance in this context. Modern anti-Semitism was originally a response to the emergence of capitalism and the dramatic changes it brought with it. The direct relations of dependence in feudal society ceded to indirect and abstract forms of rule, characterized by Marx as the silent compulsion of economic relations. The new societies nailed the values of freedom and equality to their mast. These were concepts which, though diametrically opposed to domination and exploitation in formal terms, were in fact their indispensable complement in ideological representation. One moment. Emancipation from the barriers of feudalism in general encompassed the emancipation of the Jews after centuries of exclusion and discrimination. Jews gained access to social spheres from which they had long been excluded and were able to gain a footing in new professions, especially in the cities. The Christian majority populations who were traditionally ill-disposed toward the Jews encountered them as, quote, colonizers of modernity, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. The connection between the emancipation of the Jews and the apparent threat of modernization seemed self-evident. It was in particular all those changes that contradicted the traditional feudal way of life with all its rigid rules that were experienced as threatening. Large parts of the population rightly assumed that they would lose out when confronted with the dynamics of modern society that had been unleashed by the dictates of the accumulation of capital. Henceforth, not the coherent set of traditional rules would determine one's life, but one's success or lack thereof on the market. Discontent with the uncomprehended mechanisms of a commodified society was targeted at Jews. Modern anti-Semitism essentially results from the personalization of social relations under the rule of capital and the state. I don't know if it's supposed to say. Okay, never mind. In ideological disputes, the quote Jewish question was stylized as the core of all social antagonisms. In the imagination of the new anti-Semites, all contradictions within their distorted image of quote the Jews were resolved through the myth of an alleged Jewish world conspiracy. Thus, it was possible to associate everything negative with one superior enemy. Modern anti-Semitism is a particularly perfidious fetish. The supposedly, quote, abstract aspects of capitalism, value, interest, etc., are juxtaposed to its supposedly, quote, concrete dimensions, the use value of the commodity, labor, production, etc. The anti-Semite distinguishes between good, quote, productive, and bad, quote, exploitative capital. Anti-Semitism thus emerges as a form of reductionist, quote, anti-capitalism, end quote. Because it targets only the abstract idea of capitalism, anti-Semitism is highly compatible with continued domination. Far from formulating a radical critique of the existing order, it perpetuates and consolidates the submission of the individual to the laws of modern society, enforced by state and capital. The anti-Semites are only too familiar with the characteristics they project onto the Jews, since they in fact reflect their own repressed wishes and desires. Whatever contradicts the necessary self-denial of the subjects, whatever they cannot or may not admit to themselves, is ascribed to Jews, in order then to affirm one's self-denial by persecuting it in them. Anti-Semitism is therefore an authoritarian rebellion, an impulse that potentially points towards a radical critique of society, both in theoretical and practical terms, is neutralized, mutilated, and transformed into its opposite. In a society of domination and unfreedom, the sense that things might be different has to be persecuted. The Jews thus fall prey to a ritual that one could describe as a modern form of exorcism. By attacking the Jews, the anti-Semites reassured themselves of their belonging to an ostensibly natural national collective that is meant to protect its members from the sometimes catastrophic consequences of life in capitalist society. As the subjects realize how little substance underpins their subjectivity, they flee into the imagined protective community of the nation. Quote, national mobilizations, end quote, in Horkheimer's words, quote, are the permitted alternative to revolution, end quote. For the overwhelming majority, the successful constitution of the subject is possible only if they manage to realize the sole commodity which they still have at their disposal once they have been freed from the previous social relations and face each other as atomized individuals, their labor. For the overwhelming, yet their success or lack of success in realizing this commodity lies beyond the individual subject's sphere of influence. Hence, consequently, subjectivity is an ideological construct in bourgeois society. Horkheimer and Adorno are referring to this thwarted liberation when Horkheimer and Adorno write that the anti-Semitic reaction is triggered in situations in which, quote, deceived human beings who have been robbed of their subjectivity are set loose as subjects, end quote. We are dealing then with a damaged subject. It is damaged because, in the interest of self-preservation, it has to place demands on itself which it cannot actually meet by itself. In psychoanalytic terms, the subject is forced to hypostatize itself in a narcissistic fashion, which in turn inevitably sets it up for narcissistic inquiry. The quote specific motives and quote underlying anti-Semitism Freud identified as those that spring quote from secret sources end quote. Yet it should not be forgotten that the psychology of the individual is socially grounded. While the laws of society cannot be derived from the psychological profiles of individuals, the individual is, quote, not merely an individual and the substratum of psychology, but always also, a carrier of social regulations that shape it, Even when the vulgar materialism that explains individual responses with tangible profit interests is right when compared to the psychologist who derives the economic behavior of adults that conforms to objective economic laws from their childhood, end quote. Adorno. As a side note, one of the things that was very interesting, I was listening to a piece by Karin Stugner, and she was talking about how in the United States, the original study was published in English of the authoritarian personality. It was an American study, but in Germany, it was published as the authoritarian character. Is the way it's translated, and she was talking about how the notion of the authoritarian character gets way more closer to what the the nature of what was being described by Adorno, because when you have personality is so much in general terms characterized like a private thing, like a personal thing, like if someone has an authoritarian personality, you could almost think of it as like a personal failing. Right? But the authoritarian character, as opposed to this concept of the authoritarian personality, speaks way more to this supra-individual, the supra-individual nature of this psychological authoritarianism. Anyway, the studies on the authoritarian personality revealed that anti-Semitism is complemented by various other character traits, all of which together constitute the authoritarian personality. It is interpreted as the outcome of an upbringing in a patriarchal family with a dominant father figure that is characterized by a lack of affection, strict discipline, the trivialization of inward processes, and a rigid orientation toward external conventions. This sort of upbringing obstructs a successful integration of the superego. Children are unable to develop a stable ego capable of creating an equilibrium between the urges of the id and the social norms and constraints established in the superego. The resulting weakness of the ego creates a predisposition in the individual to follow external authorities and conventions in their thoughts and actions rather than their own judgments, and to avoid making judgments of their own in the first place. Typical traits of this authoritarian syndrome are, quote, rigid conventionality as well as unreflective adherence to social norms and regulations, end quote, and a conformism that, quote, expresses alarm whenever social deviation occurs, end quote. And that quote's from A. Silbermann, Der ungeleibte Jude, Soziologie des Antisemitismus. And footnote. Since the experience of impotence cannot be admitted, it is psychologized in the, quote, feeling of impotence, end quote. Individuals, quote, are incapable of experiencing their impotence and looking it into the eye, end quote. Hence, quote, individuals have to process their impotence into a, quote, feeling and turn it into a psychological sediment, end quote. Adorno. This sense of impotence contradicts the narcissistic hypostatization of the self, and as long as the actual causes of this constellation remain opaque for the individual, it is likely to look for somebody to blame. The only thing it knows for sure is that it is definitely not to blame. A rigid moralizing upbringing leads to the repression of illicit feelings and the constant need to prevent them from becoming conscious again. Since this absorbs a considerable amount of energy, it represents a great relief if one can project the illicit feelings onto, quote, alien others. In other words, one of the means of resistance against the efforts of unconscious wishes and desires to resurface consists in seeing those wishes and desires in others while refusing to acknowledge them in oneself. Arbitrary projections are facilitated by an insufficient ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality. Those who can only see in the victims of their delusion those traits that they have repressed or cannot admit to themselves are essentially impervious to experience. Borrowing from Kant, one could say that for an anti-Semite, anti-Semitism forms the a priori of all possible experience. All objects of experience are always already shaped in a particular way, as a result of which contradictory perceptions are rendered entirely possible. The authoritarian personality, quote, feels challenged and threatened by those people who deviate from the irrational and authoritarian structure of repression, end quote. Lars Rensman. Qualities such as freedom, equality, and emancipation, which bourgeois society has been unable to realize, are attributed to, quote, the Jews. Individuals find their narcissism constantly injured as they are forced to sell themselves day by day on the labor market, painfully aware of their replaceability. They have hundreds of wishes and understand the system well enough to know they will never be fulfilled. Yet buried deep down within them, they suspect that there might be more. They sense the possibility of, quote, happiness without power, reward without work, a homeland without frontiers, unquote. The timeless anti-Semitic notion that Jews are greedy and exploitative shrouds the unconscious envy of those who supposedly do not need to work and receive everything for free, and without having to make an effort. Above and beyond the racist projection that hates and envies black people because of their imagined hypersexuality, and foreigners because they supposedly do not have to work, anti-Semitism also encompasses the alleged impotence of the Jews. While racists may envy individual foreigners because of their apparent, quote, right to laziness, this individual foreigner, nevertheless remains as powerless vis-a-vis the system as the former. The ostensibly powerful, quote, Jew, by contrast, is also hated and envied because of his omnipotence. Against this backdrop, quote, the quotidian religion of anti-Semitism offers guilty victims, suited as objects of the conformist rebellion, unquote. In contrast to the victim of racism, who is supposedly inferior, quote, the Jew, unquote, makes for an apt personification of negative authority because of his alleged intention to dominate the planet and his omnipotence. This is the crucial distinction between racism and modern anti-Semitism. Above and beyond all the benefits of racist projection, anti-Semitism offers the opportunity to act out not against the actual authorities, but against others who are supposedly in a position of authority, and thus to rebel without harming one's own collective. New section. Secondary post-Holocaust anti-Semitism, right-wing and left-wing. Secondary anti-Semitism is a particular form of modern anti-Semitism that has been shaped by the Holocaust. Secondary anti-Semitism, it seems inevitable that the attempt to annihilate European Jewry, which nearly succeeded, has had an effect on the concept and manifestation of anti-Semitism. In Germany and Austria, it is certainly impossible to analyze anti-Semitism, be it as a social and individual phenomenon, without considering the transformed circumstances following the genocide. The situation has changed insofar as an unreserved affirmation of the nation was no longer possible once the crimes had become public knowledge. In Germany and Austria, Auschwitz has become synonymous with an injury to the collective narcissism. Its recollection is effectively charged in a strong way and triggers public responses that clearly reveal the desire to deny, forget, keep secret, and relativize, leaving to one sense a core of inveterate Jew haters. Anti-Semitism after Auschwitz is anti-Semitism because of Auschwitz. Against this backdrop, the conditions of modern anti-Semitism are recycled and modified. Adorno already analyzed numerous evasion strategies of this kind in the 1950s. Take the example of the call that a line should finally be drawn beneath the past that is constantly raised in public debate, as though it broke a major taboo for the first time. In fact, this has been a constant feature of, quote, coming to terms with the past, unquote, in Germany and Austria since the late 1940s. Austria has made its own original contribution in this context by styling herself as the first victim of National Socialism. To be sure, self-victimization is not unknown in the Berlin Republic either. The annual commemoration of the Allied bombing of Dresden is an obvious case in point. Even so, the current German state, as the successor state to Nazi Germany, has not been able to evade the past in quite the same way as Austria. Secondary anti-Semitism is particularly dangerous insofar as secondary anti-Semitism allows secondary anti-Semitism's proponents to see themselves as the innocent victim acting in self-defense. Modern anti-Semitism's paranoid conspiracy theories are rarely still propagated openly. The notion that an international Jewish community is working in a clandestine manner to destroy and subjugate the non-Jewish peoples may still enthuse a surprisingly large audience. But currently, at least, it does not resonate with the broad masses. The contention that Jews are globally instrumentalizing the Holocaust for their needs, on the other hand, seems very popular. By thinking of oneself as an individual who merely wants to be left in peace, to lead a decent life, but is prevented from doing so by, quote, certain circles. In fact, seeking revenge, anti-Jewish aggression appears simply as a form of self-defense. While secondary anti-Semitism draws secondary anti-Semitism's momentum from the confrontation with the past, it is not merely backward directed. It does not differ in principle from modern anti-Semitism, but adapts it to the circumstances of post-Holocaust society. Footnote. See the article by Lars Rensman, Guilt, Resentment, and Post-Holocaust Democracy, The Frankfurt School's analysis of, quote, secondary anti-Semitism in the group experiment and beyond. End footnote. Secondary anti-Semitism thrives not despite, but because of Auschwitz. At its heart is the desire to forget the National Socialist crimes and rid oneself of related negative feelings. This paradoxical constellation has aptly been summarized in the contention that the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. In contrast to that, anti-Semitism on the left springs not so much from the desire to engage in unreserved affirmation of one's own nation, but has more to do with prevalent left-wing conceptions of capitalism and imperialism, state and nation, fascism and National Socialism. Many on the left have reduced National Socialism to a particularly heinous form of class domination by the most aggressive parts of the bourgeoisie. As a side note, it's also, I think this is just a side note from me, and I speculated. I'm speculating here. There's also the reduction of National Socialism, I think, to fascism as such. And in cases, say, in the class nature of fascism, the anti-working class nature of fascism is, I think, to what I know at least, I'm talking my ass a little bit here, so forgive me, but like definitely pertains more so to the fascist, the Italian fascist experience than the National Socialist experience. And I think also the reduction of Nazism to just fascism covers over the fact that fascism in Italy did not have anti-Semitism as a core component of its ideology in its formation, whereas National Socialism, Nazism, had it right out of the gate. I believe it's even the case that in fascist Italy, there was, and I'm not exactly sure about this, but I've heard this from a couple of sources in my research, that Italian Jews, obviously they were victims of the Holocaust, right? But to demonstrate the degree to which anti-Semitism was not necessarily an important characteristic of Italian fascism, was that further numbers, Jews disproportionately were disproportionately present in National Socialism. I mean, not National Socialism, excuse me, Jesus Christ, Italian fascism. So say if Jews were like 1% of the population, I don't know the percentage of the population of Italy, they might have been like 2% of the fascist movement. So there's this kind of like reduction of the experience of National Socialism to that of fascism as such, which is not correct. Obviously, racial science and anti-Semitism become way more of an important part of Italian fascism in its development. One of the other things that this is just more side notes for myself because it's late in the night and I'm very lonely. Is that there's also the idea, I think, this is my speculation, is that the radical left views itself as a victim, as strictly the victim of National Socialism, which is true. It is a victim of National Socialism, but also it doesn't take into account the degree to which, say, the German Communist Party, for instance, kind of paved the way for fascism in the third period of viewing, or paved the way for Nazism by viewing the, Social Democrats just as reactionary as the Nazis. That is that's a problematic history that's not really as openly addressed and taken into consideration when talking about National Socialism by leftists. Also, to the degree which I think is less known, I think there's been some. If you read the research of Olaf Kischemacher, for instance, he shows how the Communist Party of Germany, for instance, kind of viewed for instance, there's the quote from God, I can't even think of her name. I can't remember her name. It doesn't matter. But basically, the Communist Party of Germany basically adopted nationalist rhetoric and tried to demonstrate, use part of their propaganda, that the Nazis weren't really for the national interest, and that the Nazis, in fact, were secretly funded by Jews. That was a big thing in Communist Party propaganda at the time. Fundamentally, the anti-Semitism of National Socialism was not, did not make an impression on the German radical left in any serious way. And I think there's been book. Olaf Kischemacher also has published a book, I believe. I haven't read it because it's in German, and I don't have the tools to translate it myself. But I think there's a book about the critiques at the time by anarchists and other critics of the Communist Party about its kind of use of anti-Semitic tropes in its propaganda. One of the other things that I think is interesting as well is that when the Nazi Party tried to dissolve some kind of social democratic government, and there was some kind in Prussia, there was some kind of referendum about it, and the communists sided with the Nazis in this particular instance, to dissolve this government of social democrats. And finally, there's a couple other things to consider, is that the entire period of the German Nazi-Soviet pact is not discussed nearly enough on the left. And this gives the left a misguided understanding of its own past. So, for instance, there's kind of this idea that you see a lot, people talked about the Russians, the USSR had to enter into a pact with Nazi Germany because the Western powers were insufficiently forthcoming in forming an alliance with the Soviet Union, and that they basically had to, and their expansions into Finland and Poland and the Baltic states were to bolster and prepare for this Nazi offensive. And it wasn't about expansionism, Stalinist expansionism or anything like that. They were kind of had to, and that they were constantly preparing for war with Nazi Germany. There's good reason to think that, especially considering how absolutely shocked and unprepared the Soviet Union was, not just in terms of supplies or something like that, but politically unprepared for a Nazi invasion, lends evidence to the idea, to the conclusion that the Soviet Union thought that they were going to have a long-term partnership of some kind with Nazi Germany, where they basically divided Eastern Europe between themselves. Um, and obviously, the fervent anti-Semitism of the National Socialists wasn't enough to keep anyone from entering that pact. And this is one more important thing, just as a side note. Even the Frankfurt School itself, and they changed this. They changed. Other people did not change. They changed this. They thought, they had the idea, at least for a while, and I don't know how long they kept it. And I think this is the case with Franz Neumann. He might have kept it for way longer, who wrote the big Frankfurt School book, Behemoth, on Nazi Germany. But they had the idea that anti-Semitism was like a propaganda tool. And it wasn't real, in some sense. And this is kind of like a universal thing. It was kind of like a universal thing. It's not that they thought that the anti-Semitism wasn't there or that it was good or that it couldn't escalate into violence. They basically thought it was like a propaganda tool to whip up the anger of the lower middle classes and the petite bourgeoisie, the shop owners and so forth, in order to get them to accept Nazi rule. So there's all kinds of I think when you're talking about left anti-Semitism and its relation to National Socialism, and obviously that's not completely what this book is about, this paper is about, and I apologize for just riffing and talking to myself. I know you're probably listening to hear what this person has to say. But there's a lot of, one of the main things is that that keeps the left from looking at anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism within its own thought patterns with look into the abyss of it, is that they fundamentally view themselves as the victims and the victims and the opponents of National Socialism. You know, who the Soviet Union put the flag on the Reichstag, right, when it repelled the Nazi army. They don't have the relationship between the left and Nazism, especially the radical left, the Communist Party, the Stalinist parties, is way, way, way misunderstood. I think another blinder to left anti-Semitism is how within the left's history, Jews have been somewhat, I would think you could say, disproportionately present. You know, if you just think of so many people, Marx, Emma Goldman, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, and all these people, is that they think because they're the people they support, the people like heroes in it were Jewish, that makes them anti-Semitic. I mean, that kind of bars them from being anti-Semitic, right? There's also a degree to which, this is a side note, I got this from Yves Coleman, but he talks about how, and this isn't quite related to, I don't even know how this is related, but it just seems important, is that he talks about how, two important things that he mentioned were these people, Emma Goldman, Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, their Jewish identity or their Jewish background was not fundamentally important to them. It was not an important point it wasn't important for their politics. It wasn't important for their self-identity. It just happened to be the case, right? That's one thing to take into consideration. The other thing is that people think, there's this kind of tendency to have the attitude, at least, is that because Jews have been disproportionately present in the left, especially among its leadership and so on, is that the reverse is true. That most Jews were radical leftists of some kind, which has historically not been the case. And he says, I can't remember, I might want to put words in mouth. It basically says the Jews tended to vote for mainstream parties, right? So they would not be they probably wouldn't vote for, they might vote for the SPD, maybe, but they generally voted in kind of a centrist direction. Usually liberal, of course, because conservatives, might want to exclude them, but they weren't particularly radical. So there's this idea that the Bund or something like that, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm just riffing here, but the idea that the Bund represented real Jewish consciousness, as if it was the dominant Jewish organization. The anti-Zionism was in some sense the mainstream of Jewish politics. Is questionable. I think I'm not sure exactly, but the size of the Bund and its popular support among Jews in general is debatable. So there's just all these kind of things where it's they kind of all these ways that anti-Semitism can kind of the left can kind of dodge critically engaging with it, I guess, is basically the point of what I've been saying for the past 5 minutes. Maybe it's been longer, I don't know, I'm sorry. Anyway, let me restart this paragraph over. In contrast to that, anti-Semitism on the left springs not so much from the desire to engage in unreserved affirmation of one's own nation, but has more to do with prevalent left-wing conceptions of capitalism and imperialism, state and nation, fascism and National Socialism. Many on the left have reduced National Socialism to a particularly heinous form of class domination by the most aggressive parts of the bourgeoisie. Sorry, another side note. That's where I stopped last time, but there's time for another side note. Also, what should be mentioned here is the most aggressive parts of finance capital is what should be added here. Despite, if you just look at it's been a little while since I read the Nazi Party program, but one of the articles of their program was the abolition of interest. Which interest being the main form of income for finance capital, right? The main form of surplus value appropriation, right? Anyway. For the longest time, the annihilatory anti-Semitism of the Nazis was largely ignored or understood functionally as a means of domination and distraction. See? I know what I'm talking about. A distraction deployed in the interest of goals other than annihilation of European Jewry. The traditional left conceptualizes capitalism not as a fetishized social totality that should be criticized for its reification of social relations, but rather as the total sum of all capitalists with whom the working class finds itself in constant irreconcilable conflict. This inevitably generates a binary, reifying, personalizing, and moralizing imagery, imaginary, which hinges on the notion of a clique of evildoers who rely on direct repression and blunt propaganda, and who corrupt the working class with social policy in order to dominate the ruled. Critique and activism are thus directed not against a particular set of social relations, but against the people who actually or allegedly represent one side of these social relations. And herein lies the structural analogy to anti-Semitism. Consequently, many of the left also subscribe to a reductionist concept of imperialism that identifies imperialism with foreign rule and exploitation by foreign capital. The uncritical identification with movements of national liberation in the developing world has led to the affirmation of categories such as state, nation, and people. This kind of anti-imperialism, which cannot distinguish between the critique of imperialism and unreserved partisanship for the victims of imperialism, almost inevitably leads to a collaboration with dictators, folkish nationalists, and anti-Semites. After the Six-Day War in 1967, leftist anti-Semites have come to depict Israel as an imperialist Goliath, who should know better, given his experience of the Shoah, than to behave like the new Nazis and make Arabs in their country the new Jews of today. In contrast to the right-wing anti-Semites who try to cover their anti-Semitism through the use of codes as the, quote, East Coast, leftist, quote, reputable anti-Semites, end quote, Amari, are proud of their alleged anti-fascist engagement against Israel. New section, New Anti-Semitism. Especially since 9/11, a far-reaching ideological convergence of anti-Semitism has taken place across a range of ideologies and milieux that traditionally have precious little in common. At its heart lies a form of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism on which Islamists and many on the far right and the left can agree. All of them see themselves and the world as the victims of some kind of Jewish Zionist capitalist conspiracy that is being played out in politics, the economy, and the media. This notion tends to merge closely with anti-Americanism, the critique of globalization, and anti-modernism. In addition to Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, which help us pinpoint when the so-called, quote, Israel critique, end quote, is anti-Semitic, demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, Monica Schwarz-Friesel and Yehuda Reinhartz have introduced an overarching category, derealization. So let me look some of these people up. I know the 3Ds, but I don't know who this Natan Sharansky is. Wikipedia says Natan Sharansky, born 1948, is an Israeli politician, human rights advocate, and author. He served as chairman of the executive for the Jewish Agency from June 2009 to August 2018. He currently serves as chairman for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, an American nonpartisan organization. A former Soviet dissident, he spent 9 years in prison as a refusnik during the 1970s and 1980s. Back to the text. Monica Schwarz-Friesel. Wikipedia says Monika Schwarz-Friesel, born 1961, is a German cognitive scientist, professor at the Technische Universität Berlin, and one of Europe's most distinguished anti-Semitism researchers, according to Mark Neugroschel from the newspaper The Times of Israel. She is often interviewed by media outlets like Haaretz, Der Standard, Der Tagesspiegel, on her research on current forms of anti-Semitism, which often take place on the internet. Back to the text, and Yehuda Reinhardt's. Who is Yehuda Reinhardt's? Wikipedia says Yehuda Reinhardt's, born 1944, served as president of Brandeis University from 1994 to 2010. Yehuda Reinhardt's was the Richard Corrett Professor of Modern Jewish History and director of the Tauber Institute for the Study of European Jewry at Brandeis. Yehuda Reinhardt's is the president and CEO of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation. On the 25th of September 2009, Reinhardt's announced his retirement as president of Brandeis, but at the request of the Board of Trustees, he stayed on until a replacement could be hired. On the 1st of January 2011, Reinhardt's became president and CEO of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation. Back to the text. Derealizing linguistic utterances do not portray reality as reality in fact is, but language is rather instrumentalized by the language generators to verbalize aspects of the world as they view them. This leads to the derealization of current anti-Semitism as the existing threats and attacks against Israel. Of the existing threats and attacks against Israel. This way, quote, state terrorism, end quote, of the evil Goliath always appears disproportional. As the global anti-Zionist struggle that is being conducted on a daily basis by right-wing extremists, left-wing opponents of globalization, Arab fighters, and those motivated by radical Islam unfolds, the book market is being flooded with publications whose authors tend to wear their hearts on their sleeves, but also seek to distance themselves from the card-carrying anti-Semites. It is no longer a secret that left-wing anti-imperialism and the anti-globalization movement have a problem with anti-Semitism. On the one hand, there is the rampant anti-Zionism that turns various European and social justice forums into festivals of multicultural hatred against Israel. On the other hand, there is a form of critique of the global economic order, which has repeatedly been accused of arguing in a manner that is, quote, structurally anti-Semitic, end quote. The ensuing controversy tends to hinge not on matters of substance, but on the issue of correct terminology. Given that very few proponents of this agenda want to be classified as anti-Semites, the more sophisticated among them appropriate theories of anti-Semitism in order to develop modes of expression that have not been delegitimized by Adorno's critique. Some of them have understood that it is not opportune to display images that show the world in the arms of a repulsive octopus, though this imagery remains exceptionally popular among anti-globalization activists. Yet their underlying assumptions about the state and the economy remain the same, and they fail to critique the social phenomena which crystallized into anti-Semitism. Even worse are the debates regarding Arab-Muslim anti-Semitism, which, for the most part, simply fail to address the issue and principally focus on questions of terminology. Usually the first question raised is that of whether an anti-Semitic tradition existed in the Arab world, or anti-Semitism was in fact imported from the West. The disparagement and contempt that is the Islamic tradition displayed toward Jews doubtless influenced the ideologue of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb. Horkheimer, Adorno, and their colleagues insisted that modern anti-Semitism, while not divorced from its religiously motivated precursors, was nevertheless distinct for Adorno and Horkheimer due to the emergence of abstract forms of domination as capitalism transformed the world in capitalism's image. This same process has also taken place in the Arab world, although with a certain delay and under economically and politically less advanced circumstances. Traditional Catholic anti-Judaism may have influenced Hitler, but it is not central to an understanding of Hitler's anti-Semitism. In this process, anti-Jewish hatred there has been transformed into murderous modern anti-Semitism as well. Where in the past Jews were persecuted in the same way in the Arab realm as Jews were in Europe is therefore not all too important. More important are the ideological processes that accompany the capitalist transformation. And it is clear that in this context, modern anti-Semitism has proven to be as successful in the Middle East as it was in Central and Eastern Europe. The focus on pre-modern traditions thus signifies a fundamental lack of interest in the phenomenon of modern anti-Semitism from the outset and prevents a critique of social conditions that allow anti-Semitism to enthuse the masses in Cairo as much as it inspires the Iranian regime. Even people who know about secondary anti-Semitism and may well have heard of, quote, anti-Semitism without Jews, end quote, can suddenly account for anti-Semitism in the Middle East in no other way than by blaming the Jews. Insofar as social causes come into play at all, they are conceptualized as the ostensible consequences of European colonialism, once again turning the problem into one ultimately created by Europe. Those unwilling to tackle rigid sexual morals, genital mutilation, and the regressively repressed homoeroticism of the Muslim Ummah can obviously muster little more than a shrug of the shoulders when confronted with the suggestion that anti-Semitism has something to do with the repression of wishes and desires in an oppressive society. As Omar Bartov has shown, a central element of, quote, new anti-Semitism, end quote, is the belittlement of Islamist anti-Semitism in the Western left. The example he discusses is the speech of the Malaysian Prime Minister, Muhammad Mahathir, in 2003 at the Islamic Conference, in front of 57 heads of state and 2,000 journalists. Quote, today the Jews rule this world by proxy. They get others to fight and die for them. They, this tiny community, have become a world power. We cannot fight them through brawn alone. We must use our brains also. 1.3 billion Muslims cannot be defeated by a few million Jews. There must be a way. And we can only find a way if we stop to think, to assess our weakness and our strength, to plan to strategize and then to counterattack. As Muslims, we must seek guidance from the Al-Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. End quote. Muhammad Mahathir, or Tir, I'm not sure, Mahathir. In reaction to that, Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times that the, quote, remarks were inexcusable, but they were also calculated. For Mahathir is a cagey politician who is neither ignorant nor foolish. Mahathir is about as forward-looking a Muslim leader as we're likely to find. ... So what's with the anti-Semitism? Almost surely it's part of Mr. Mahathir's domestic balancing act. Now Mr. Mahathir thinks that to cover his domestic flank, he must insert hateful words into his speech mainly about Muslim reform. End quote. Paul Krugman belittles Mahathir's anti-Semitism as a domestic strategy of a forward-looking statesman and blames the U.S. for anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. This derealization of Islamist anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the Western left has become a dominant part of a new global anti-Semitism. New section. New anti-Semitism and new media. Against this theoretical background, I argue that there is one significant distinction between the function of the new media for right-wing as opposed to left-wing users. The frequently discussed anonymity of the internet allows right-wing users to express anti-Semitic opinions more openly than they otherwise might. Left-wing users, by contrast, feel no urge to hide behind pseudonyms in the first place, since left-wing users, after all, quote, virtuous anti-Semites, end quote. Many of them see themselves as anti-fascist activists. So why the need for anonymity? In this case, the problem lies elsewhere. Left-wing and center-left new media platforms and forums claim that they ban not only racist and sexist but anti-Semitic content too. Yet anti-Zionism and the deterioration of Islamist anti-Semitism turn out to be a blind spot, and thus the codes of conduct turn out to be a toothless tiger when it comes to leftist anti-Semitism. In the following, I analyze reactions to Hamas's new policy paper from May 2017 on leftist internet platforms and in the form of the Austrian daily paper, Der Standard. In scholarly literature that does not turn a blind eye towards Islamist anti-Semitism, the Hamas Charter of 1988 is often presented as an example of blatant anti-Semitism. It claims, quote, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. ... The movement is but one squadron that should be supported by more and more squadrons from this vast Arab and Islamic world, until the enemy is vanquished and Allah's victory is realized. The Zionist Nazi activities against our people will not last for long. The Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, quote, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims kill the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. End quote. Hamas Charter, 1988. In 2017, Hamas sought to widen its international appeal at a time when the group faced, quote, multiple challenges, including a dismal economic situation in Gaza, most recently underscored by the energy crisis in Gaza, and strained relations with Egypt, which is at war with Hamas's parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, end quote. M. Levitt and M. Rich, Hamas's moderate research belies militant activities. Published at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, May 1st, 2017. End footnote. The relationship with the Iranian regime, too, had become tenuous. One of the reasons, as a side note, one of the reasons why the relationship it doesn't say this here, but I'm going to take a wild guess here, is that one of the reasons that the relationship between Hamas and Iran became tense is because in Syria at the time, I'm not exactly sure about the finer dates of the Syrian civil war, but Iran was supporting Assad and Hamas was supporting the Islamist opposition. So Iran via Hezbollah was supporting Assad, uh, that charming character, and Hamas was supporting the Islamist opposition to Assad. I'm not sure how serious. I'm not exactly sure. I know, like, Hezbollah was supporting Assad full stop. I'm not sure about if Hamas's relationship to the Islamist opposition was purely just on paper or not. Anyway, that's my guess. The relationship with the Iranian regime too had become tenuous. Its new policy paper of May 1st, 2017 demonstrated the group's desire to appear more moderate and gain broader support. Hamas's, quote, goal is to liberate Palestine and confront the Zionist project. ... Palestine, which extends from the River Jordan in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, and from Ras al-Nakura in the north to al-Rashrash in the south, is an integral territorial unit. ... Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project and not with the Jews because of their religion. Yet it's the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and a legal entity. The Zionist movement, which was able with the help of Western powers to occupy Palestine, is the most dangerous form of settlement occupation which has already disappeared from much of the world and must disappear from Palestine. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine, from the river to the sea. However, without compromising its rejection of the Zionist entity and without relinquishing any Palestinian rights, Hamas considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to their homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula of national consensus. ... There is no alternative to a fully sovereign Palestinian state on the entire national Palestinian soil, with Jerusalem as its capital. End quote. Hamas. 2017. Hamas claims then that its conflict is with the Zionist project and not, quote, with the Jews, end quote. Yet it still demands that the Zionist project should, quote, disappear from Palestine, end quote, which should be liberated, quote, from the river to the sea, end quote. It refers to a, quote, national consensus, end quote, calling for a return to the status quo ante. That is, the state prior to the Six-Day War of 1967, yet at the same time demands a Palestinian state, quote, on the entire Palestinian soil, end quote. Rather than discuss Hamas's claim that its conflict is not with the Jews, but only with Zionism, I want to analyze the reactions to the policy paper on the German-speaking left. Needless to say, the, quote, left is the post-Nazi German, in the post-Nazi German and Austrian context, encompasses a broad range of positions. Representatives for the lunatic fringe of the discourse on Hamas, Israel, and the Middle East is, quote, the Palestine portal, never again, no one, nowhere, end quote. Its section on the anti-Semitism, representative for the lunatic fringe of the discourse on Hamas, Israel, and the Middle East is the, quote, is the Palestine portal, never again, no one, nowhere. Its section on anti-Semitism bears the heading, quote, no to anti-Semitism, no to anti-Semitism's instrumentalization, end quote, which already indicates that the portal focuses on the denunciation of the critique of anti-Zionism. Before Hamas published its policy paper in 2017, the portal provided a link to a site which presented Hamas as, quote, not radical in its entirety, end quote, and, quote, not the Taliban, end quote. Hamas was a group comparable to the PLO in the 1980s, with which the Israelis and the U.S. should negotiate. To exclude it from talks just because, quote, the military arm of Hamas has carried out assassinations, end quote, would be, quote, unfair. In 2009, the portal claimed that the continued reference to the 1988 charter, quote, completely ignores Hamas's development in the last 10 years, end quote. From a resistance and activist group to a political party that relies on democratic means. Reading this shit in the light of October 7th is so upsetting. Quote, the use of excerpts from the Charter of Proof of Hamas's anti-Zionist militancy turns out to be rather embarrassing for those who quote them, as soon as one makes the effort of putting those quotations back into the context from which they were torn, end quote. So even before the policy paper was published in 2017, the Palestine portal denied Hamas's anti-Semitism, only to clarify after its publication that while the charter may have been radical, quote, the new Hamas document merely lends expression to forms of politics that have been undergoing a process of, quote, moderation, end quote, for the past decade anyway. But because Hamas does now agree to a Palestinian state within the borders of 1967, the two-state solution, Netanyahu needed to denounce Hamas as, quote, rejectionist, on the grounds that it does not recognize Israel, end quote. No mention was made of the continued call to wipe Israel off the map. The Israel reaction was immediately identified as the real problem. Netanyahu had argued that Hamas, quote, brainwashes kids inside suicide camps, end quote. Hence the text author suggests, quote, it would be interesting to look at some examples of the violent brainwashing of children by Israel, end quote, instead. It is worth mentioning that the equation of Israeli policies with those of the Nazis is standard fare for the portal's founder, Erhard Arendt. Quote, it was shocking for me to realize that those who used to be the victims have now become the perpetrators, end quote, he wrote on one occasion. I'm almost definitely sure it was not just something he said on one occasion. This is something you hear constantly, all the time. Back to the text. Sorry, I was trying to look this guy up, but I don't find anything. More mainstream center-left media do not imply that the Israelis are the new Nazis, but they too pursue a similar derealization strategy, readily misinterpret the Hamas Charter of 2017. In the German Taz, Susan Knoll claimed that, quote, for the first time in its history, Hamas has officially accepted the foundation of the Palestinian state, only in the territories occupied by Israel. This paper no longer concludes the explicit demand for the annihilation found in the Hamas Charter of 1988. The military wing has had to agree to turn its back on its founding fathers, end quote. Jesus Christ. And this is kind of the problem. This is just like, sorry to just talk to myself. On the one hand, this far-right government, the Netanyahu government, which does not seek a two-state settlement. But there's also, it's like, if it was to seek a two-state settlement, say the Labor Party came in, who would be its partners in this event, right? Like, if if what granting a Palestinian state would entail was the legitimization on the international arena of a state that fundamentally that didn't seek to just be a state and have equal rights, and hopefully, if in time it became possible and there was a peaceful relationship between the two countries, that there could be, a flexible, a more open border policy right between them. If that was kind of like the goal, right, where Jews could live in the occupied territories, and Arabs from the Palestinian territories could move into Israel freely, if that was, say, like the goal. Who would be their partners? What they do would be legitimize. They would be creating a state that would have international recognition, that wanted to destroy it and wipe it off the face of the earth right next to it. It's not just cruelty or disrespect for human rights or something like that that prevents Israel from granting a Palestinian state. There's structural, strategic reasons. If they're like, the ideal of a two-state solution is should be held onto, but there's very, very serious problems with it, right? If the state that's granted if you grant it a state, and then that state just prepares for war, or is a sponsor of terrorism against Israel, then Israel's 100% just shooting itself in the face if it does that. So there's a lot of like structural reasons why there's not a two-state solution, that is not just the cruelty or the unfairness of Israel. And obviously, and this is the thing, is that there's like, when people talk about the two-state solution, or like binationalism or something like that, there's this idea that that's what the leadership of the Palestinian movement actually wants, at the very least. It's a little bit harder to say what the population of Palestine wants, although there's protest against Hamas, but there's also celebratory participation when they paraded bodies through Gaza on October 7th. So there's a degree, there's different, it's hard to say what is the dominant view of this, like of the Palestinian people, or something like that. There's if like, it's like, who, there's no guarantee that there's absolutely not even just a guarantee, or there's not even a hope that this state is going to be a peaceful state. It's a very interesting thing that you hear, that there's a lot of times, sometimes when people observe this, like it's like a tragic clash between two national peoples over a strip of land. On the one level, that's true, but I think it's more and more convincing to a lot of people, and this is like, for instance, why like I think this is some of the reasons why people like I don't know actually where I was going with that, but like there's this idea that it's just like it's Israel and the Palestinians, and Israel's just such a dick that they can't work out a peace process, and they can't have and Israel has the backing of the United States, so the whatever peace plan is going to be skewed in Israel's favor, or something like that, right? That's like a general feeling, but I think there's there's something to be said that in 1948, in the Arab-Israeli war, that it wasn't two state entities fighting over borders. It wasn't a border dispute. It wasn't a territorial, dispute. It was Zionism. It wasn't versus Israelis versus Palestinians. It was Zionists versus anti-Zionists. The main goal of the Zionists was to have a state at all. The goal of the other side, the Arab side in the conflict, which, to say, it was the... Obviously, I'm sure people did have very different opinions if they weren't, didn't have those opinions beaten out of them. But the overall opinion was not between Palestinians and Zionists, but anti-Zionists and Zionists. The Jews wanted a state. That was their most important thing. The other side, the most important thing is that there was no Jewish state at all. Right? It wasn't that there was it wasn't like there's it wasn't like, I don't know, France and Germany or fighting over a border. It wasn't like United States and Canada fighting over a border. It was like if United States and Canada were in a war and the goal of the United States was just to destroy Canada. Full stop. So it's a very difficult thing to think about, because a lot of times you kind of have this idea, it's like, oh yeah, why isn't it working out? And it's like, it really is Israel's opponents do not have just the finer details of... It's not a dispute over it's not like a dispute over this or that. It's an existential dispute. And it's not just a dispute between as much as other people would like to claim. It's not just a dispute between a state. Whether a state, it's the people that state as well sets out to represent. Anyway, I was really rambling here. I'm sorry about this. Leaving to one side that the area still under Israeli occupation would make for a rather limited Palestinian state, as we saw, Hamas's continued demand for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea explicitly calls for Israel's annihilation. Moreover, Hamas officials have made very clear that the paper does not in fact replace the charter. In contrast to leftist newspapers, the liberal German newspapers Die Zeit and Süddeutsche Zeitung do mention both of these points. In the liberal conservative monthly Cicero, Michael Wolfsohn explicitly called the Hamas paper a new facade for an old building designed to hide Hamas's anti-Semitism. All too many, he lamented, were falling for this ruse. The Austrian center-left quarterly newspaper Der Standard reported on the Hamas policy paper on the 1st of May 2017 and on Netanyahu's response the following day. I will briefly mention the points raised in these two reports and then analyze the reactions to them in the Standard Online forum. Typical of center-left media, Standard Online wrongly referred to the Hamas paper as, quote, a document in which Hamas accepts the establishment of a Palestinian state in the borders of 1967, end quote. A small minority of those posing responses to this article 4 out of 56 resorted to derealizing arguments. Quote, Maynard 52, for example, claimed that, quote, Hamas never wanted to kill Jews because they are Jews, but to resist the Zionist occupiers. Have you actually realized that there was a brutal occupation regime in place, unquote? Here, Hamas's crude anti-Semitism was simply denied altogether. Another user posted under the name, quote, shitty little country, unquote, thus alluded to the infamous utterance of the then French ambassador to London, Daniel Bernard, 3 months after the attacks on 9/11, at a dinner party at the wife of the then proprietor of the Telegraph, Conrad Black, and his wife, Barbara Emile. Bernard had referred to Israel as a, quote, shitty little country, end quote. On Emile's account, he had gone on to ask why the world should be, quote, in danger of World War III because of those people, unquote. Same shit always. Quote, I am only allowed to criticize Israel if the situation is changed, end quote. The user who had chosen to post under this name asked indignantly and went on, quote, but the current system in which everyone who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite actually works quite well, unquote. The claim that one is not allowed to criticize Israel and that any and every critique of Israel is automatically considered anti-Semitic is, of course, a central plank of the anti-Zionist, quote, critique of Israel, end quote. Even though there is a clear and obvious distinction between criticisms of specific policies or actions of the Israeli government or military and the comprehensive delegitimization of Israel. Another user Burius wrote, quote, don't worry, Israel will continue to receive more money for its illegal policy than Hamas, end quote. Quote, which one, end quote, another user asked. Quote, the illegal settlement policy, the illegal policy of defense, the illegal human rights policy, end quote. J. Tiberius responded, in the world of conspiracy theories, it seems self-evident that Israel is receiving money from non-specified outside forces. The policy of defense is tied together with the debatable settlement policy, so that both can be portrayed as illegal in the same way. A second report published by the Standard Online dealt with the reaction of the Israeli government to the Hamas paper and wrongly claimed yet again that, quote, Hamas has dropped the call for the destruction of Israel, end quote. Since the main topic of this second article was Israel, the tone of the responses became much harsher. A, quote, Helena Kurtz resorted to one of the most common demonization strategies when she asked, quote, what do you expect from the warmongers Netanyahu and co? A Der Wiedergänger, meanwhile, was sure that, quote, the Palestinians can try whatever they want. It will never be enough for Israel. QED, it becomes clear once again who is standing in the way of peace, end quote. A Callimachus, who regularly takes issue with the narrative in the Standard Forum, summed up the anti-Zionist derealization in the following way, quote, self-defense is war, terror is resistance, peace is the destruction of Israel, end quote. Taken out of context, this remark might even be mistaken for a particularly drastic anti-Semitic comment. Along the identification of Israeli warmongering as the sole source of conflict, equating Israel with apartheid South Africa is another popular delegitimization strategy. The, quote, the user, whose name is Minced Meat, wrote, quote, I call Israel's policy apartheid and I am absolutely right, end quote. Note the absence of an actual argument and the self-assuredness that a coalition of 4 Arab-dominated parties, the, quote, Joint List, is currently the third largest party in the Israeli parliament, or that Salim Gibran served as the country's first Arab Supreme Court justice from 2003 to 2017, facts like these are simply ignored. Wikipedia says Salim Gibran was a judge of the Supreme Court of Israel. He served as a Supreme Court justice from 2003 and became a permanent member in May 2004. Gibran was a Christian Maronite heritage and affiliated with the Arab Christian community. Gibran was the first Arab to receive a permanent appointment in the Israeli Supreme Court. He was also described as the second Arab judge to hold a Supreme Court appointment, preceded by Abdel Rahman Zouabi, who held a fixed 9-month appointment in 1999. Quote, "My soul slides away," end quote, was sure, the user, sorry, back to the text, the user, "My soul slides away" was sure that, quote, "over 95% of schools are segregated. In my eyes, this is racial segregation," end quote. On similar grounds, quote, Tiefgang claimed that Israel was not a democratic state. Quote, "Today's greater Israel is a product of robbery and will never be accepted in this form. But Israel does not care about this either. Israel prefers to stay an exclusively Jewish state, a theocracy, instead of constituting itself as a democratic state," end quote. A user calling himself Staatsvertrag finally implied that Israel was doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis had done to the Jews. Responding to a user who had pointed out that Israel had withdrawn from the Gaza Strip in order to obtain peace for land, and that Hamas was entirely to blame for the comprehensive Egyptian and partial Israeli blockades, quote, the user, Staatsvertrag, asked, quote, which, quote, land was given back. Definitely not Gaza. Gaza is still under siege in an open-air prison, a ghetto, end quote. The depiction of the Israelis as the new Nazis keep the Palestinians in a ghetto. Who keep the Palestinians in a ghetto is a well-established trope in, quote, anti-fascist anti-Semitism, end quote. It is important to note that the Standard Online is the moderated form of arguably the most respectable quality newspaper in Austria. According to its code of conduct, quote, "No racist, sexist, misogynic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, or other misanthropic posts," end quote, are allowed. Yet anti-Zionism and denial of Israel's right to exist are evidently not considered problematic. Not even the equation implied by referring to Gaza as a ghetto is identified and censored as anti-Semitic. As opposed to right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism does not blossom under the protection of anonymity. It is self-assured and forthright. It is high time that new media platforms and forums firmly incorporate anti-Zionism into their definitions of anti-Semitism. They need to ban postings which claim that Israel is an apartheid state, imply or openly demand that Israel must be destroyed or dismantled, or suggest that Gaza is a ghetto, and thus imply that Israelis are the new Nazis. None of this has anything to do with censoring criticism of Israeli policies or actions. Nor does the critique of leftist anti-Zionism and the leftist tendency to whitewash Islamist anti-Semitism amount to the claim that, quote, the left is anti-Semitic. Yet neither, given its prevalence in centrist and center-left media, can one dismiss the problem of secondary post-Holocaust anti-Semitism simply as a problem of the extreme right and a few activists on the loony left. And that's the end of the piece. And it says, Ljiljana Radonić, heads a project on globalized, unquote, globalized memorial museums exhibiting atrocities in the era of claims of moral universals. At the Institute of Cultural Studies and Theater History at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, funded by the European Research Council. Her habilitation project on World War II and post-socialistic memorial museums was funded by the APART postdoc fellowship at the Austrian Academy and the Elias Richter program of the Austrian Science Fund, FWF. Radonić has been teaching at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna since 2004. Thank you so much for listening.